In this video, we're going to be going over some of the most challenging sounds to master in Portuguese, the nasal sounds, which you see in words like mãe, pão, and corações. Along with the open and closed vowels that we saw in the last lesson, these are the sounds that Portuguese learners tend to have the most trouble with. So first of all, what are nasal sounds? They're basically sounds that push air through the nose when you pronounce them. To actually feel this, you can put your finger right under your nose and say the word hunt. You should feel a little bit of air coming out of your nose when you say it. So we actually have nasal sounds in English, but Portuguese takes this to a whole different level. Let's take a look at some. Now, I want you to just listen to this word. Bang. Bang. This is how it's written. B-E-M, bang. This means well. Notice how the EM is pronounced. Ain. Almost like it's got an NG at the end. Now listen to the next word. Dang. Dang. How would you guess it's spelled? Dang is spelled T-E-M, and it means he or she has. The next one is vain. Vain. How would you spell this word? Vain is spelled V-E-M, and it means he or she comes. How would you say this word, which means without? Sane. Sane. How would you say this word, which means not even? Name. How would you say who? Just a hint, the QU here is pronounced with a hard K sound. Quem. How would you say they do? Fazem. How about they know? Sabem. So you notice how the EM in these words is pronounced very differently in Portuguese. For an English or Spanish speaker, the tendency is to want to pronounce the EM as M, where your lips touch at the end. But in Portuguese, it's pronounced ain. Your lips never touch. Now listen to the next set of words. Pensar. Vender. Ensinar. Fluente. So what do you notice here? The EN in these words are pronounced just like the EM in the words that we just saw. Ain. In these words, you want to avoid pronouncing the N like you would in English or Spanish, where your tongue touches the roof of your mouth. So it's not pensar or vender, it's pensar and vender. Now listen to this word. Sim. Sim. So how is this written? S-I-M, sim, which is the Portuguese word for yes. Notice the pronunciation, in. And just like the EM that we saw earlier, the IM sounds almost like it has an NG at the end. Now listen to the next word. Fim. Fim. How would you guess this is spelled? Fim is spelled F-I-M, and it means end. The next one is mean. Mean. How would you spell this word? Mean is spelled M-I-M, and it means me. How would you say this name? Remember that the J here is pronounced with the J sound, as in the word measure. Jobim, who is the composer of the song Girl from Ipanema. Once again, you want to avoid pronouncing the M like you would in English and saying im. Your lips should never touch at the end. Im. Now listen to these next couple. Lindo. Sinto. So what do you notice here? The IN in these words are pronounced just like the IM in the words that we just saw. ing. Again, you want to avoid pronouncing that N. Your tongue should not touch the roof of your mouth when you say the ing. So it's not lindo or sinto. It's lindo and sinto. So how would you say this word? Pintar. How would you say welcome? Bem-vindo. So here you see bem-vindo has two nasal sounds. The EM in bem and the IN in vindo. Now on to the next word. Bom. Bom. Let's see how this is written. B-O-M, bom, which means good. Notice how it's not pronounced bomb. It's bom. Once again, the lips never touch at the end like they do in the English word bomb. Now listen to the next word. Com. Com. How would you spell this one? Com is spelled C-O-M and it means with. How would you say this word, which means sound? Som. Som. How would you say brown? Remember the double R is pronounced with an H sound, as in the word hot. Marrom. Marrom. Now listen to the next words. Onde. Contar. How would you say 11 in Portuguese? Onze. How about wave? Onda. So you see how the ON in these words are pronounced the same as the OM in the words that we just saw. On. I hope you're starting to see a pattern here. On to the next. How is this written? U-M, which is just the indefinite article A in Portuguese. Notice how I'm not saying The lips never touch at the end. The next word is algum, which means any or some. To fulfill is cumprir. Cumprir. How would you say tuna? Atum. Now on to the, you guessed it, UN words. How would you say world? Mundo. How about second? Segundo. Once again, you don't want to pronounce the N like you would in English or Spanish here. The tongue should not touch the roof of your mouth. So it's not mundo or segundo like in Spanish. It's mundo and segundo. How would you say together? Junto. And lastly, never? Nunca. Nunca. Now listen to this word. Campo. Campo. Let's see how it's spelled. Campo, which means field, as in soccer field, is spelled C-A-M-P-O. So it's not campo, but campo. Lips never touch to pronounce that M. How would you say this word, which is a city in São Paulo? Campinas. How about this one? Just a hint that there are two nasals here. Também. Também, which means also. How about this word? Samba. Let's take a look at the AN words. Cantar, to sing. Bandeira. Quando. Mandar. So the key once again is to not pronounce the N like you're used to. If you're making the switch from Spanish, you're going to be really tempted to say cantar, bandera, cuando, mandar, instead of cantar, bandeira, quando, and mandar. Now, I want you to pay close attention to the pronunciation of the following words that end in AM and see how it differs from what we just saw. Falam, they speak. Falaram, they spoke. Falavam, they would or used to speak. Falariam, they would speak. So the AM, when it comes at the end of a word, is generally pronounced and not Now this sound is one of my favorite sounds in Portuguese. Besides seeing it in words ending in AM, you'll also see it in the following words. The first one is bone. Bone. So how is this spelled? Bone is bread and it's spelled P-A-O. Now, this isn't just any A. This mustache-looking accent over the A is called a tilde. And in Portuguese, it tells us that we have to pronounce it with a nasal sound. So instead of pau, it's telling us that we have to say bone. Our next word means hand. How would you say this? Mão. Mão. So now you should know how to pronounce this city correctly in Portuguese. São Paulo, which literally means St. Paul or San Pablo in Spanish. How would you say brother? Irmão. Irmão. So a lot of words in English that end in tion, like action or emotion, usually have a similar equivalent in Portuguese ending in in the singular and ons in the plural. For example, ação is action, while ações is actions. This C with the little hook at the bottom is pronounced like the C in city. The word for emotion is emoção, and its plural form is emoções. Nation is nação, while nations is nações. Opção is the word for option, and opções means options. So to summarize what we've learned in this lesson, we've got the sound represented by the AM and AN, as in samba and cantar. The ang sound, which you see in words with EM and EN, as in bem and pensar. The ing sound, as seen in words with IM and IN, as seen in sim and lindo. The on sound, represented by the OM and ON, as in bom and onde. The sound, which are in words with UM and UN, as in algum and mundo. The sound, which you see in words that have this AO, as in mão, and also in those that end in AM, like falam. And finally, the oing sound, represented by the OE, as in opções. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from this lesson, it's that in words with nasal sounds, the M and N are never pronounced. They're really just there to indicate that the preceding vowel is nasal. Now, if that M or N is followed by a vowel, like in the word problema, in that case, then you would actually pronounce the M or N. But at this point, don't worry too much about memorizing any rules. These first few lessons were mainly just to introduce you to some of the more common pronunciation patterns as we start getting into the meat of the course. So I hope you got value out of this video. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Obrigado.